Every founder you admire is a statistical anomaly. You've been studying their morning routines, their book recommendations, their origin stories in garages and dorm rooms. You've been reverse engineering success from the tiny fraction of people who made it, while ignoring the exposed bones of everyone who tried the same thing and vanished. By the end of this, you'll understand the invisible graveyard that surrounds every success story, and why seeing it clearly is the most strategic advantage you can give yourself. In World War II, the US military had a problem. Bombers were coming back from missions riddled with bullet holes, wings, fuselage, tail. Engineers proposed reinforcing those damaged areas. A statistician named Abraham Wald said something that still echoes, "You're looking at the planes that survived." The holes show where a plane can take damage and still fly home. The planes that got hit in the engine never came back. Reinforce the engines. That's survivorship bias in its purest form. And you're living inside it every time you scroll through a business podcast feed. The entrepreneur who mortgaged their house, maxed out credit cards, and built a billion-dollar company gets a Netflix documentary. The entrepreneur who mortgaged their house, maxed out credit cards, and lost everything gets silence. Both took the same bet. One got lucky with timing, market conditions, a connection at a conference, an investor who happened to check their email at the right moment. The other got equally unlucky with forces just as random. But you only hear one of those stories, and the distortion shapes every decision you make. Think about the advice you've absorbed this year. Wake up at 5 a.m., drop out of college, move fast and break things, burn the boats. Each of those strategies worked for someone famous enough to tell the story. For every person who dropped out of college and built a tech empire, thousands dropped out and spent a decade recovering financially. Their advice would sound different. Stay in school makes a terrible podcast title, though. The problem runs deeper than bad advice. Survivorship bias warps your understanding of risk itself. When you only see winners, risk looks manageable, exciting even. The garage to glory narrative makes entrepreneurship feel like a vending machine. Insert sacrifice, receive success. The ratio of sacrifice to success is closer to 100 to 1, and that's generous. You just can't see the 100. Because they have no platform, no book deal, no reason to broadcast their pain. So what does the actual data look like? Depending on which study you trust, somewhere between 60 and 90% of startups fail. The numbers vary by industry and definition of failure, but the direction is consistent. Most new businesses die, and the ones that survive often limp along as modest operations, far from the rocket ship trajectory that dominates your feed. The median outcome of entrepreneurship is years of grueling work for less money than a stable job would have paid. That's the base rate. Everything else is noise dressed up as signal. Here's where your brain fights you. Humans are wired to learn from stories, and stories need protagonists who succeed. A narrative about someone who tried hard and failed teaches you, what exactly? Your pattern-matching instincts rejected. There's no actionable takeaway, no formula to extract, so you skip it. You click on the winner, and the algorithm which feeds on your clicks serves you more winners. The feedback loop tightens with every session. You've probably felt the downstream effects without naming them. That quiet sense of personal failure when your business hits a wall, the assumption that you're doing something wrong because the people you follow seem to glide past the obstacles crushing you. That comparison is poisoned at the source. You're measuring yourself against a curated highlight reel drawn from the top fraction of a percent. A venture capitalist named Paul Graham once wrote that the best founders he met were often indistinguishable from the ones who failed. Same intelligence, same drive, same willingness to sacrifice. The variable that separated them was frequently timing and luck. Graham funds startups for a living. He has every incentive to sell the myth of skill-based success. The fact that even he admits the role of chance should recalibrate something in your model. Now, does luck mean effort is pointless? This is where people overcorrect. They hear survivorship bias and conclude that trying is futile, that success is a lottery ticket. That's the wrong lesson. Effort dramatically increases your odds. Skill matters. Preparation matters. But they matter the way training matters in a marathon where half the runners get randomly tripped by an invisible wire at mile 20. You still train. You just stop assuming that everyone who finished must have trained harder than everyone who fell. The most dangerous version of this bias operates at the strategy level. You study what successful companies did and assume those actions caused the success. Company X launched with a minimum viable product. Company Y spent 2 years perfecting before launch. Both succeeded, both get profiled. 1,000 companies launched with minimum viable products and died. 1,000 perfected for years and died. The strategy that worked is often just the strategy that happened to coincide with success. Correlation in a sample size of 1. The financial media runs on this engine. Every profile of a self-made billionaire is structured the same way. Early struggle, bold bet, vindication. The template itself is the distortion. Struggle plus bold bet produce is skewed toward positive outcomes. You overweight the upside and underweight the realistic probability of ruin. You've watched someone close to you, maybe a friend, maybe yourself, make a career decision based on a success story, quit the stable job, pour savings into the idea. Feel the intoxicating certainty that comes from reading about someone who did the same thing and won. That certainty is borrowed from a survivor. The people who could have warned you are invisible, broke, embarrassed, and silent. So what do you actually do with this? Start by changing how you consume success stories. Every time someone tells you what worked for them, mentally populate the room with 100 people who did the exact same thing and failed. Ask yourself, would this advice still make sense if I knew most people who followed it lost? If the answer is yes, the advice might be genuinely good. If it only sounds good because you're imagining a guaranteed outcome, you've been sold a map drawn by someone who found water in the desert by walking in a random direction. Seek out failure stories deliberately. They're harder to find because nobody monetizes them. But founders who've been through bankruptcy, failed launches and dead-end pivots carry knowledge that winners often lack. They know what the warning signs look like from the inside. Winners frequently can't tell you why they won. Losers almost always know exactly where things broke. Adjust your relationship with risk. Risk is fine. Calculated risk, with a fallback position you can survive, is how most lasting businesses actually get built. The bet everything narrative is compelling precisely because it's dramatic. Drama is the opposite of strategy. The founders who quietly kept their day jobs for 18 months while building on the side, who launched only when revenue covered their mortgage, they fill fewer headlines and more tax brackets. Critics of this framing will push back. They'll say survivorship bias analysis breeds mediocrity, that overanalyzing risk kills ambition. And there's something to that. Excessive caution is its own trap. Some of the greatest ventures in history required irrational confidence and tolerance for catastrophic downside. The Wright brothers, for instance, had no statistical basis for believing human flight was achievable. They just kept building. The counterargument holds weight until you examine how many of their contemporaries died in identical attempts that history forgot. The Wrights survived. Dozens of aviation pioneers from the same era didn't. You know the Wrights' names for the same reason you know lottery winners' names. The clearest upgrade available to you is this: separate the inspiration from the instruction. Let success stories motivate you. Feel the energy. Then, before you copy a single tactic, go find the base rate. How often does this approach actually work? What does the typical outcome look like? What did the people who failed have in common with the people who succeeded? If you can't find answers to those questions, you're navigating by someone else's luck. Your bookshelf is probably full of survivor testimony. The advice feels solid because the person giving it is rich, famous, successful. The advice might be solid, or it might be the equivalent of a lottery winner telling you to pick the numbers that feel right. You can't tell the difference without seeing the full dataset. And the full dataset includes everyone who disappeared. The graveyard is real. The planes that didn't come back carried pilots who followed the same training manual. Knowing that changes how you fly.